Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 252. This week the questions are taken from guides 306 and 307 on HMS Calypso and SMS Koenig, and the Wednesday videos on Admiral Jackie Fisher, the first one we looked at looking at his personal career, and the video looking at USS Olympia from the US 2022 tour, plus a little insert from the National Maritime Museum video celebrating the return of the models. David asks, in relation to the video on HMS Calypso, what is the feature of the beached ship that appears to be a vertical tunnel through the stern? So the photo, as you can see here, is of SMS Adler, one of the German ships that was wrecked, and that vertical tunnel you can see is for the ship's screw. So a fair number of ships in the latter part of the 19th century that still operated at long distance and would operate primarily under sail, which could range from gunboats like the Adler here in the latter part of that period to even full-scale capital ships like HMS Warrior back in the early part of the second half of the 19th century, back when engine efficiency wasn't anywhere close to enough to guarantee long-distance voyaging on coal alone. It was thought that if you could lift the screw out of the water and thus out of the stream that was passing past the ship's hull, this would improve the ship's hydrodynamics, and thus the ship would travel faster and more efficiently under sail than if the screw was in place. This sometimes worked. I mean, if you go to HMS Warrior or HMS Gannet in the UK, for example, you can see that both of them still have this facility, but the process of disengaging the screw and then lifting it up into this tunnel above the waterline was a fairly complicated process, and then of course you had to do the whole thing in reverse if you wanted the screw back in, which meant that quite often where it was possible to do, the ship's crew tended, if it was a two-bladed propeller, to either just fix it in a vertical position or leave it freewheeling, because both of those were easier to do and easier to re-engage than the whole lifting process, which was, a good idea, but not necessarily one that lasted all that long. JBPA asks, what is overspeeding and how is it countered by the crew in situations like that mentioned in the video on the Calypso class and HMS Calliope? Overspeeding in this context is when a ship's propeller starts to race far faster than it should, which can result in damage to, well, any part of the ship's drive system and indeed the ship itself. So the problem comes from you have a certain amount of power going into the ship's propeller shaft. That is, of course, turning the propeller. The propeller is turning through the water. The water provides a certain amount of resistance, and so you need X amount of power to turn the propeller through the liquid at Y RPM, which then gives you your speed. Now, unfortunately, if you suddenly enter a medium that is significantly less dense and thus offers significantly less resistance than water, like, say, air, because your ship is pitching and rolling and etc. in an extremely violent storm, as was happening to HMS Calliope, then all of a sudden you have exactly the same amount of power pushing that propeller around, but nowhere near as much resistance, and suddenly the propeller speeds up dramatically. Now, that in and of itself can have some negative consequences because the bearings, the lubrication, etc., of your propeller shaft may not be designed to support an RPM that high. And the engine having suddenly to jump from, I don't know, let's say 100 RPM to 500 RPM, that's going to result in some mechanical shocks there as well. And the increased number of revolutions, of course, increases the amount of force that is being exerted by the propeller shaft per second on its surroundings. So the propeller mounting brackets, etc., and the shaft alley might also start to breach. And when it comes to ships, you've also got to bear in mind that it's very, very unlikely that this situation is going to persist for very long, which means you're going to have propeller blades moving pretty quickly, and sooner or later, most likely sooner, they are going to slam back into the much denser medium of water, which is going to result in a whole other set of shocks that could bend or distort or snap the propeller blades, or as things carry further along up the propeller shaft, various other parts, again, of the ship's drive system. So it's definitely not a good thing to occur. I mean, you can, as a very basic example, think of if you put your foot down in your car, okay? So if you're accelerating, your vehicle's RPM, or the vehicle's wheels RPM is a certain amount. If you lose traction, so now effectively your wheel is turning with just the resistance of the air, so the resistance of the road, you get wheel spin. And then when your tyre re-engages with the road, you get a huge cloud of smoke and the tyre is partly wrecked or possibly even fully wrecked, depending on how much you've been doing this. So now imagine that, except with massive bronze propellers and hitting solid water. You get some idea. Now, how it's countered by the crew, well, sometimes it's not possible to counter it completely. Sometimes it's not possible to counter it at all. But if you have a certain degree of control over the power being delivered to your propeller shaft, and you can change that power relatively quickly, then aboard a ship, for example, by varying the amount of steam pressure that is being put through the engines, you can then obviously vary the amount of power the engines are producing, which will then vary the amount of power that's being transmitted to the propeller. Now, this is obviously a very delicate and fraught operation. There are inherent delays in how this power is transmitted, depending on when you cut the steam, etc., or increase the steam pressure. So there is a bit of a lag involved. And as I said, you can't necessarily do it on all systems. It's much easier to do with something that's easily throttleable, like a modern diesel engine, than it would be to do with a turbine engine or a vertical triple expansion engine, which was what was on Calliope. Well, it was an expansion engine of some description. I don't think it was vertical triple. But in any case, if you're very careful, you can mitigate the effects of overspeeding. And it might sound like this would be an incredibly difficult task, and yes, it would be. But you are helped by the fact that you can obviously feel the ship pitching. So as you feel the ship pitch up, or feel the stern at least pitch up, you can preemptively start to reduce power. And then as you feel the ship begin to descend, or you feel the stern hit the water, so you know the propeller's back in the water, then you can increase power again. And it's all about judging, essentially working out the lag, and then judging, okay, when do I need to drop power so that when the screw comes out of the water, it's either losing power or has lost power, and when do I need to increase the power such that by the time the screw is fully immersed, I get power back again. It's incredibly difficult to do, but a skilled engineering crew can pull it off. Eamon asks, having just watched part 3 of the Nelson videos, was there any consideration toward building a frigate with 32-pounders? Would such a ship be feasible? And if not, why not? There was consideration towards building frigates with 32-pounders, and indeed later on in the Age of Sail, they were built. For example, this is a Royal Navy example from the 1830s. And earlier on, there again were some frigates that had 32-pounders, although they, in the context of the very early part of the 19th century, were razes. So they were older ships of the line that had their upper gun decks cut down, and because they'd had 32-pounders on their lower gun decks, they continued to have 32-pounders on their lower gun decks. However, in order to have a ship where the hull can withstand the recoil of 32-pounders as opposed to 12, 18 or 24-pounders, as well as to accommodate the just physically larger guns, so you need a longer vessel, and the guns themselves are somewhat longer and heavier, so you need a wider vessel as well, because you need to maintain your length to beam ratio and you need to maintain your stability. It would mean that a 32-pounder frigate or 32-pounder armed frigate would be considerably longer and wider than your average frigate of the time. There were one or two other ways you could try and deal with this. Obviously, you could just overload it and hope for the best, which was a bad idea. You could, or downrate it in terms of total number of guns carried, or you could do what the USS Essex of the War of 1812 fame had tried to do, which is to just use 32-pounder carronades, which solves the weight issue. Although obviously that failed when it came up against a ship that was just armed with long guns, even if the long guns were smaller. So in the end, it was accepted that, well, the only way you're going to get a 32-pounder broadside on a frigate using long guns is to just make the ships bigger. And if you compare the typical 18 or 24-pounder frigates of the early 19th century, late 18th century, and then you look at the first few 32-pounder frigates and their immediate successors, you find that on average, a 32-pounder frigate is about 20 to 40 feet longer and 4 to 6 feet wider than your typical 24 or 18-pounder frigate of the same broadside. Now, there are a few exceptions to this. The big American frigate, so USS Constitution, for example, if you look at her waterline hull length and her beam, she is actually big enough to suggest that you could have her with a 32-pounder broadside as opposed to a 24-pounder broadside, which she historically does. But when you look at the number of guns and the type of ships and the size, we're talking about a 36-gun fifth rate being around about the size of Constitution to mount a 32-pounder broadside, whereas Constitution, of course, additionally has that whole upper deck of carronades. So if you wanted to have your 36-pounder fifth rate and another couple of dozen carronades up top, then your ship's going to get correspondingly larger still. So Constitution, as built, is kind of verging on fourth-rate territory, but if you were to convert her to a 32-pounder ship, she would become a comfortable fifth rate, but you'd have to lose a lot of those upper deck guns. And of course that increased size comes with increased cost, and since frigates are supposed to be your general purpose ships that are all over the place, and they're not really built to withstand incoming 32-pounder fire as much as anything is, then you only end up building those ships out of necessity because everybody else is escalating as well. And to give you some kind of idea, those 32-pounder frigates, and indeed Constitution, in terms of length and beam, are actually roughly on a par with the length and beam of third-rate ships of the line, i.e. your typical 74-gunner. The difference obviously being the 74 gunners have 2 full gun decks plus an upper deck, whereas frigates only have 1 full gun deck and maybe an upper deck depending on their configuration. And of course the third rates are significantly more heavily built, but that's why, for instance, when you cut their decks down, they can retain their 32-pounder gun deck, because that turns out actually that's about the size you need to mount this broadside. Scott Mason asks, my parents and I were watching a documentary on the ocean liner Rex the other night, and they mentioned that the Italians had a liner called Giulio Cesare in service at the same time as the battleship with the same name. And it got me thinking, for navies that didn't have HMS or USS before their ship's name, if there was ever any confusion between ships owned by the same nation with names that were the same in the Navy and the merchant fleet, or would it have been more of an issue for foreign navies? Usually there wouldn't be any confusion, because even if the Navy in question didn't use prefixes for its warships, the merchant vessel, whether that be a passenger liner or a freighter or whatever, would have to use at least a generic international prefix, usually SS for steamship. So during the careers of various naval vessels, there could sometimes be several ships that shared their name, but were merchant vessels of some description. The French battleship Britannia had at least 2 merchant ships called SS Britannia, built by different people in service while she was around. Obviously, this is the liner Giulio Cesare, in service at the same time as the battleship Giulio Cesare. RMS Queen Elizabeth was in service at the same time as HMS Queen Elizabeth. And the situation was further helped by the fact that, generally speaking, if you're talking about print media or announcements, you would have references to what kind of the ship was involved. So the battleship or the liner, etc., etc. So whilst on the surface it might appear easy to confuse them, usually it was relatively easy to tell them apart, precisely because no one wanted to actually accidentally end up confusing them. Niels Larsen asks, did Imperial Germany actually build any battlecruisers? Germany classified them as große Kreuzer, or large cruisers in English. Some few have referred to them as Schlachtkreuzer, but that's about as credible as Bismarck's pronoun being he. Also, from a doctrine perspective, it doesn't make sense for Germany to build battlecruisers. The battlecruiser being an answer to a specific British problem, the Germans not having the same problem and thus no need for them, but being fully aware of what the battlecruisers were capable of if they were placed in the screening force, i.e. overpower the enemy reconnaissance forces, which would consist of armoured cruisers, in order to leave the enemy blind. And so these large cruisers, the Großkreuzer, replaced the armoured cruisers in the German recon line. Hence, from a building perspective, the German large cruisers do not resemble the British battle cruisers. I think it runs dangerously close to playing a semantics game, because in that sense you could argue that the British didn't, at least at first, build battle cruisers either. They built dreadnought armoured cruisers, which is kind of similar to your argument the Germans built large armoured cruisers. And ultimately, both sets of vessels, the British and the German, were designed with roughly the same mission profile in mind, the destruction of enemy armoured cruisers. It was just that initially the British design focused on the destruction of enemy armoured cruisers overseas, and then they would come back to destroy the enemy armoured cruisers in the scouting line, whereas because they existed, when the Germans got round to building their reply, and obviously the Germans weren't going to be trying to use their battle cruisers to wipe out all of the British armoured and protected cruisers patrolling the sea lanes, because they knew that really wouldn't work, they were then looking at basically the second stage of the British mission profile, the destruction of enemy armoured cruisers and light cruisers, protected cruisers in their scouting line. So essentially they were both looking at the same mission profile, just the British had an extra theatre to execute that profile in. And then secondarily, there was also a role of supporting the battle line. Now, okay, to be fair, in that section, both of the ships differed in their profile a little bit, because you've got to remember they're both derived from armoured cruisers, and the armoured cruiser, for a long time in the pre-dreadnought period, was held to have a place in the battle line. The development of the battle cruiser, quote unquote, is essentially, as the name suggests for the British initial versions, the dreadnought version of the armoured cruiser, so theoretically it still does have some kind of supporting role in the battle line, but as I said, the difference being that the British viewed the battle cruiser's role in the battle line as very much an ancillary support arm that could maybe get ahead of the enemy or pursue a defeated enemy, but really wasn't supposed to get into a straight-up duel with them. You know, the main duel was supposed to happen between the Grand Fleet and the enemy fleet, with the battle cruisers chipping in from ahead or behind or the side as necessary, i.e., you know, they're there to throw large shells at the enemy, they're not necessarily there to receive large shells in return all that much. Whereas the Germans, because they had the smaller fleet, they recognised they needed to have all the help they can get, and therefore it made more logical sense to have their battle cruisers capable of taking a bit more punishment than the British did, at least at first. And this is the thing. There are effectively two separate generations of British battlecruiser contemporaneous with the Germans. As Niels points out in his larger question, you know, the German ships are generally somewhat more heavily armoured, have slightly less firepower, and are a little bit slower on average than their immediate British contemporary, once you're dealing with reasonable sea conditions. But they still have roughly the armament of the existing battleship they correspond to, for the most part, and they generally follow the battlecruiser rule of just having slightly less of it. They also, compared to the latter British battlecruisers, Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger, etc., also tend to follow the other general battlecruiser rules. They're faster than their contemporary battleships by a fair margin, and they have both slightly thinner armour than their contemporary battleship, and they have it distributed in, you know, a slightly smaller area. And this is one of the key things a lot of people miss with German battlecruisers, because sometimes they'll look at something like a Der Flinger and they'll go, oh yeah, well, you know, the Der Flinger was just as well armoured as most battleships. No, it wasn't. It had the main belt thickness that was comparable to some contemporary battleships, But when you look at contemporary battleships' armour layout and you look at how much of an area those contemporary battleships had covered by similar or slightly greater thicknesses of main belt armour, the German battlecruisers, as in common with most battlecruisers, had that thickness covering a lesser area. They were really stripped down to cover the absolute bare minimum that was necessary for survival, comparative to a battleship. And of course, the roles for everybody's quote-unquote battlecruisers change quite rapidly over time. When Invincible and her sisters are initially launched, the idea is almost entirely focused on commerce destruction and then uncontested destruction of the enemy scouting line. By the time World War I arrives, the destruction of the enemy commerce raiding vessels, because most of those have shifted over to U-boats, is suddenly much less of a concern. After the Falklands, it's pretty much done as far as what the battlecruisers can accomplish, at which point they're much more thrust into being the scouting line, and the existence of the German equivalents means that they have to be now the forward scouting element, as opposed to just being there to support the armoured cruiser scouting element. And so what exactly a ship was designed for and what role it actually ends up playing in World War I most of the time can be a very, very different thing. Hence, I think it's fair to say that both sides built battlecruisers, and so did the French, the French designed battlecruisers, but the Japanese also built battlecruisers. You know, battlecruiser is, it can be a little bit difficult to define because there are so many roles involved, and as we just said, the roles keep changing. But broadly speaking, in terms of a ship approximately the size of a capital ship that is faster than its contemporary capital ship, but less well protected, and has slightly less main armament, both the British and the Germans and the Japanese are all building ships that match that description, and most other people are designing ships that match that description. Borodino's, the unnamed French design, the Lexingtons and various other US battlecruiser designs, etc. They're all fitting that rough bill. And so you might as well all call them battlecruisers, because if you start to pick apart and say, well, this was the primary mission of this particular thing, so it's not a battlecruiser, then it means that actually you end up in a position of even saying that the main people who built the most battlecruisers, the British, didn't actually build battlecruisers. You'd end up splitting them into at least 4 separate generations, and you'd have to come up with a name for every single one of them. You basically have the Invincibles and the Indefatigables in one, Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary and Tiger in another, Renown and Repulse in another, Hood in yet another, and that's before you get into the ones like Lexington, Amagi and G3. So I think it's just better to call them all battlecruisers, personally. Christopher Rowe asks, this comes from my grandfather's memoirs when he was in command of USS Ranger. She was providing air cover for SS Queen Mary during her cruise from the UK to Halifax with Churchill aboard for the Quebec Conference. Lieutenant Commander Elmer Dunn, Ranger's chief engineer, had an idea and was given permission to turn fire hoses on the main bearings and get a few more turns out the propellers. Ranger's war diary indeed shows she increased her speed from 26 to 27 knots and sustained it for over 22 hours. My question is, how would this work? I mean, Ranger was theoretically capable of faster than 27 knots, at least when she was launched. What speed she exactly was capable of in the particular sea conditions, loading condition, and machinery condition when she was in the middle of World War II is another matter entirely, but let's take it as read that they're indeed doing this to try and get a few more turns out of the propellers. So there are a couple of things that this could relate to, and they're basically the same thing. So you put a certain amount of power into the propeller shaft, kind of like what we were talking about earlier on with overspeeding, and some of that energy is going to be lost on the bearings that hold the propeller shaft up, the various brackets that convey it down to the back where the screws are. And also you have the thrust blocks, which are sometimes also called the thrust bearings, which have the thrust pads, which is how most of the force of the propeller is transmitted into the ship to make the ship go forward. Now, obviously, friction creates heat, and despite your best lubrication efforts, there will always be some friction created. And as there's more power and more speed going into the propeller shaft being rotated, that's going to lead to more friction and more heat, and then eventually that will start to burn off or evaporate the grease and all the other lubricants you're using, which can and also cause expansion, which can cause more sticking, which can cause more friction, and then you end up with a feedback loop, and eventually something locks up and everything goes horribly wrong. So, my theory, based on the entries that you describe, would be that recognizing that either the bearings or the thrust pads or the thrust block or the thrust bearings or whatever, but some part of the system that was related to the propeller shaft would run hot if you ran it at more power or more RPM than it was ostensibly designed for. If you then take the fire hoses and you spray down the outer casings, you're of course cooling the heat, the thing, so you're reducing the amount of heat, which means that even as heat is being generated, it's being sapped away, hopefully quicker, which will hopefully keep the lubrication going, which would then allow you to get the propeller shaft either turning faster or with more force than it would normally allow. Although one presumes you'd also have to set up the pumps in the area to take away all the water that the fire hoses are projecting. Because, of course, in theory, you could use the pumps to just recycle the water into the fire hoses, but one, contaminants, and two, in theory, eventually that water would just heat up. Edward Dunn asks, what went so poorly with HMS Acheron's machinery that the Royal Navy decided that high-pressure boilers and machinery wasn't worth the effort for at least another decade? It's a little difficult to work out because from the readily and easily available information, there's not a huge amount around. There's lots of references to mechanical issues, but not a huge amount that tells us what those mechanical issues were without diving deep into engineering reports and so forth. However, putting together some stuff from D.K. Brown's Nelson to Vanguard, as well as the proceedings of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, it seems that Acheron's machinery suffered from high-pressure turbine distortion, i.e. the blades themselves, as well as leaks and various other issues, and a lot of vibration and what was called impulse juddering, which Brown notes wasn't necessarily unique to the 500 psi installation. It seemed to be an issue with some Parsons turbines generally, but was more pronounced at the higher pressures. D.K. Brown also notes that in comparison to contemporary US destroyer high-pressure plants, which didn't have these issues, the Parsons turbine seems to have basically just been the standard Parsons turbine, but with more pressure in it, whereas a number of more advanced US high-pressure turbines had considerably shorter blades, and the rotors were a single forged piece of metal, as opposed to being built up out of sections, and that gave it more strength, more rigidity, less prone to vibrations, and of course, when you're talking about the moment of force being exerted, if your turbine blades themselves are somewhat shorter, then that exerts less stress on the blades as opposed to the Parsons turbines, which seem to have used the older style longer blades, which would then be more subject to flutter and vibrations and all sorts of problems at higher pressures. So it would seem that that was the root cause of the problems on the Acheron's machinery, which then discouraged the Royal Navy from taking things further. And D.K. Brown also notes that these changes to US turbines were specifically, proprietary advances that were made by private companies, which were then incorporated into US Navy ships, which in turn obviously would not be readily available to something like Thornycroft or Parsons or Yarrow. And this would explain why it was, not a case of, oh, well, we'll just change that then, because they probably didn't necessarily know about it until much later. And when they did, there would be all sorts of peacetime IP laws to circumvent, or not, as the case may be, in order to get these systems installed on British destroyers. Christopher Babylon asks, a question I have is, we've seen the difference between Italian heavy cruisers, regular destroyers and battleships of World War II compared to their contemporaries. How do the Italian light destroyers compare to their counterparts in other navies, both friend and foe? Well, it depends what you mean by light destroyers. Some people, when they say that, they actually are talking about things like the Speaker-class torpedo boats, which are, well, as the name suggests, are quite small little things, less than 1,000-ton standard displacement. But, yeah, in that case, well, actually, in both cases, there's not too many contemporaries to look at, but if you're talking about actual small destroyers compared to the regular Italian destroyers, which by this point were averaging over 2,000 tons, then you'd be talking about the Freccia and, I think it's Freccia or Fracchia, and Folgore class destroyers, because they're about 1,200 tons-ish, just over 1,200 tons standard, as compared to their 2,200 plus ton regular fleet contemporaries. So basic stats, obviously they're destroyers, they've got no armour, and their speed is a little bit low compared to the average destroyers, 30 knots. Their armament is actually not too bad. They have a pair of twin 4.7-inch guns, so that means they actually still have 4 guns. It's just in 2 mountings, as you can see here. This is Fulmine, which is a Folgore class, and that looks from the side like a single mounting, but that is in fact a twin 4.7-inch mounting. And then they have 2 triple torpedo tubes for a total of 6 torpedoes, plus obviously various anti-aircraft armament, depth charges, etc., etc. Now, the problem with comparing ships at this displacement is that, one, nobody else was building ships of exactly this displacement around about the same time, and two, not only did technology advance, obviously, but when you're looking at this kind of, just over 1,000-ton displacement, you have to be very exact with the displacement to make sure you're doing a fair comparison. Because, when you're talking about a battleship, 500,000 tons each way probably doesn't make too much odds for World War II. But when you're talking about a 1,200-ton displacement ship, 100 tons each way, 1,100 or 1,300 tons, can make an absolutely huge difference in what you can fit in and therefore what performance you're going to get out of it. But if you take a grab bag of ships that are vaguely within the right displacement category, the French bourrasques they're built considerably before the Folgores and Freccias. They also have 4 guns, although 4 single 5-inch guns, and they also have a pair of triple torpedo tubes and a speed of 33 knots, but only about 2/3 the range of the Italian ships. Much further forward in time, at just under 1,200 ton standard, are the Type 4 Hunt class destroyers. I mean, admittedly, there's only 2 of them, but still, they've got 3 torpedo tubes, so 1 triple launcher, but they have 6 guns, albeit they're only 4-inch guns, and their range is even less, because, the Hunt class are basically escort destroyers, so their actual range at half-decent speed is also less than Folgore, but they're also somewhat slower. It's not really exactly a surprise. They are slightly smaller ships by standard displacement and considerably smaller ships by full load displacement. You've got the Japanese with the Matsu class, which are early mid-1940s design. Again, roughly similar standard displacement, but considerably less full load displacement. 2 knots slower, 1 less gun, but they're 5-inch guns as opposed to 4.7, so near resolution makes no difference. And fewer torpedoes, only 4 torpedoes in a single quad launcher. So the Matsus are less capable overall, except by range. They're just a fraction longer range, but again, like the Hunts, reflecting the fact they are designed for convoy escort more than anything else, and so they have a fair bit of light AA. The other end of things for the Japanese, a little bit heavier vessels, just over 1,300 tons, is the Mutsukis, their last pre-big destroyer design, and they have 4 4.7-inch guns, so very, very similar to the Folgores, although again in singles rather than twins. They also have a pair of triple torpedo tubes, fair enough. They have slightly better range, and they are considerably faster, topping out over 37 knots. But then again, these are full fleet destroyers, and as we said, they are also a little bit larger to start with. For the Germans, the Type 1939 torpedo boat, again, is probably the closest. They also have 4 guns, 4.1-inch guns rather than 4.7s. They also have 2 triple torpedo launchers. Their range is, again, less than the Folgores, by quite a bit. It's about 2/3 again. So they have a slightly lighter armament, lower range, but they make up for that by having a top speed that is a little bit higher, 33.5 knots. So broadly speaking, in this very odd grab bag of destroyers that displace between 11 and 1300 tons standard, you have a general pattern where the Folgores are competitive to slightly high-end with their armament. Their torpedo armament is pretty much standard for ships of this size, although there are ships that have less. No one has more at this scale from the examples picked. They are at the lower end speed-wise, although again, there are 1 or 2 that are slightly slower, the ones that are designed specifically for convoy escort work. But the Folgores and the Frechias, or Frechias, whatever, they do have a pretty decent range on them compared to most of the others, which is a decent advantage, I would say. Almus Quatch asks, is it true that medieval or early modern Chinese ships were more advanced than contemporary European ones, such as Columbus's ships versus Zheng He's, for example? Are the Chinese ships actually more technologically complex or just larger? Well, it depends how you quantify technologically advanced. To a certain extent, especially when it comes to wooden ships of this era, being able to build ships of such a size is an evidence of technical advancement. Of course, then you enter the whole realm of arguments of exactly how large these treasure ships were. If you take things as kind of very basic standard interpretation, they're absolutely colossal vessels, which would imply a degree of wooden shipbuilding technology that is massively in excess of European shipbuilding at the time. Bearing in mind, this is kind of the it's the early 1400s, so it's the late 14th, early 15th century. But at the same time, if you accept some of the more commonly cited interpolations of what the dimensions of the treasure ships actually mean, well, you still end up with some pretty impressive vessels, but you end up with vessels that are maybe 20, 30 foot longer than some of the biggest contemporary European vessels. The key difference, however, I think being that the really, really big European vessels at the time, like the Grace Dieu, that's not to be confused with the Henri Grace Dieu, which is a bit of a later vessel. Now, those are one-off, recorded by their contemporaries as one-off massive showpieces made by kings and emperors, and decidedly not standard in any way, shape or form. And very often they actually have very short service lives, whereas the Chinese treasure ships, as well as being about the same size or a bit bigger, for the larger examples, are obviously built in somewhat greater quantities, and B, actually go to do some fairly useful activities, pottering around the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. So, broadly speaking, I would say that the average Chinese treasure ship reflects not only that they are a bit larger than most of the large European prestige ships, but they are a bit more technologically advanced because they're not a regular production ship, but the Chinese can produce quite a number of them for specific purposes, as opposed to the kind of bordering on just about able to build this as a one-off showpiece for a specific nation, which is par for the course in European history at that point. Of course, you then end up with ships gradually becoming larger and larger and more standardized in Europe, and the Chinese kind of retreat away from the kind of treasure ships that they're building. So, in a way, Chinese shipbuilding regresses a little bit afterwards. Joris Amalan asks, looking at the model of the K-class, I'm struck by the cross-section of the bow. Why is that hourglass shape? I would expect you'd like as much elbow room in the torpedo room as possible, for quicker reloads if nothing else, and I wouldn't expect there to be any pressing hydrodynamic reason for it. This is a compromise between the needs for the submarines to travel at speed for prolonged periods of time on the surface, for which you need a more ship-like bow, and the fact they are submarines, so they still have to fire torpedoes. So what you're seeing up top is the superstructure, which has this kind of flare like the bow of a ship, more specifically like the whaleback type of destroyer, which was prevalent maybe 10 years before the K-class was designed. And then below, where you've got the torpedo tubes, though that's the extension of the pressure hull that the torpedo tubes actually make up. So the main pressure hull itself is actually further back, probably terminating somewhere around about with the dive planes. And then you've got the torpedo tube doors, but then that lower bulge, which is leading to the hourglass shape, that's actually almost certainly going to be the torpedo tubes themselves, or a good chunk of them. And then, of course, the back end of those torpedo tubes will be in the pressure hull, which will then be in within the submarine main body itself. And in fact, if you look at this plan of the K-class in their original configuration, you can see the main pressure hull with the officers' quarters mark there does actually end pretty much exactly where I said it would at the dive planes, and then the torpedo room is marked. You can see there's 3 flooding sections marked above it. The torpedo room is kind of this little stepped down extension of the pressure hull, and then you've got the torpedo tubes at the very end, which is obviously where the torpedoes get fired out from. So yeah, that's the reason for the K-class slightly weird bow shape, and of course it does get weirder later on when they refit it. It's a compromise between working as a submarine, being able to launch torpedoes, but also having a hull profile that allows it to run at theoretically 21 knots on the surface. J. Mace asks, in the documentary series Victory at Sea, Episode 9, Sea and Sand, at the 12-minute 53-second mark, we see a man looking through what appears to be a rangefinder. Starting at the 12-minute 55-second marker, we see what appears to be one side of a large rangefinder that has what looks to be 2 holes for letting in light. Why are there 2 holes, and why are they offset? Given that there are 2 holes, is it possible there is not another side, and this is a non-symmetrical rangefinder? Now, this is very definitely the one end of a rangefinder. It's fairly consistent with a number of others. Whilst I can't be 100% sure, I suspect that what we're looking at is a duplex rangefinder. So if you look at some pictures of the ones of the rangefinder that's found on the Littorio class battleships on their turrets, they also have 2 lenses, and those are definitely duplex rangefinders. And a duplex rangefinder normally is actually one that has a stereoscopic and a coincidence rangefinder built into it, but sometimes it can just literally just be 2 pairs of the same built into the single unit. So I suspect that's what we're looking at in this case. People may feel free to chime in otherwise, but the most common instances I can find of rangefinders that have 2 equal-sized or near equal-sized lens ports like this tend to be the duplex style, which we know the US Navy did use in not quite a number of its ships. Hi, Bacon Bomb asks, I've heard a story that sailors of the Royal Navy would bleat like sheep at HMS Rodney and Nelson. Was there any truth to that, and was there any other ship in any navy where sailors would say or do something whenever a ship was seen? Well, the rumour went that a sailor aboard HMS Rodney was caught having, shall we say, inappropriate relations with a sheep, and thus as a form of mockery / kind of sarcastic warning, whenever she was seen by large populations of sailors from other ships that knew of this rumour, there would go on the bleating to, let's say, kind of mock the crew, but also to, I guess, also similarly in a sarcastic manner, warn the population that people of this inclination were coming into port, and presumably for local shepherds to lock up their best-looking ewes. Nonetheless, as far as I can tell, that's supposed to have just been Rodney, although I guess Nelson might have caught some of the flack from that because, well, she's not Rodney's sister ship, and if a bunch of sailors see the rather distinctive profile of a Nelson-class battleship pulling in to port, Sailors are not necessarily always known for their patience, so they may just conclude that, well, better be safe than sorry. Just in case it is Rodney, we shall send out the usual mockery-warning call. As far as other ships in navies where sailors would say or do something whenever ships were seen, there's a lot of reported stories like that. People begging USS Porter not to shoot at them, for example. Or USS Washington's crew constantly trying to pick fights with USS South Dakota's crew if they were in the same port at the same time, and thus usually having to be separated. And more transient chants that might go on for a few months or a year or two when one ship had bested another in something like the ship's regatta or some kind of sporting contest. But as these things are largely informal and, as said, in some cases transient, it's only the really, really notable ones that get recorded, or sometimes just an incidental one gets written down somewhere that later that account becomes somewhat prominent. So I'm fairly sure the various ex and current Navy service members who are viewers of this video may be able to chime in with some additional traditions that they used to chant at various ships, either of their own navy or other navies, whenever they saw them. Brian Smith asks, I've been listening to several books lately and they don't really seem to paint a good light on the PT boats of the Pacific. How useful or successful were they in attacking other warships? Well, the PT boats faced a number of issues, specifically attacking warships. Attacking supply ships and barges, they were actually really useful. But attacking warships, yeah, they generally didn't do that well. And as I say, there's a few reasons for that. One of the biggest factors is, drumroll please, their torpedoes were defective. Why did everybody see that one coming? For a very, very long period of time, PT boats' torpedoes were notoriously bad. They had a whole raft of issues, rather separate from the issues that the Mark 14 had, but issues nonetheless. So that didn't help. Another factor, they're fairly small and they're fairly fragile. With the best will in the world, unsupported PT boats do not operate very well against any kind of significant warship. The bigger warships outgun them, are virtually proof to anything the PT boat can throw at them other than a torpedo, which, as we just said, usually didn't work. And especially in the Pacific, the PT boats can be seen even at night by the phosphorescent tracks that they leave passing through plankton and algae and so forth, which of course can also make it easier to spot the bigger ships, but the bigger ships don't really mind, because if both sides spot each other, the bigger ships are going to win that gunfight. And of course the Japanese are quite good at night fighting in terms of night vision and night spotting, which further complicates things because the cover of darkness is one of the things where, you know, these small boats would have theoretically a natural advantage. Because realistically, the idea of using what's essentially an overgrown outboard motorboat armed with some torpedoes to attack enemy warships was something that pretty much had gone out of the way in the 1880s. PT boats, motor torpedo boats, MAS boats, S boats, etc., the various iterations thereof used across different navies, proved to be much more effective against merchant ships who are much less capable of fighting back and also somewhat slower. Occasionally, they would experience success against warships, but that tended to be in very narrow, very confined waters, usually where they had significant home field advantages or the advantage of complete cover of darkness, which, as we just said, in the Pacific, thanks to the phosphorescence of large parts of the water there, was significantly more complicated for the PT boats in their regular operating theatre. They did also operate in the Mediterranean and in the English Channel, for example. And whilst the various island battles, the Solomon Islands campaign, etc., do involve theoretically a fair bit of cover, it's not quite the same as somewhere like the coast of Europe or the Mediterranean. Over in the Pacific, even amongst the island chains, there tends to be distinct land masses, even if there are a number of them. But to get at the ships, they tend to be a little bit further out, which again makes the approach somewhat more obvious. So there are a lot of environmental factors plus the non-working torpedoes working against the PT boats. And to be perfectly honest, also, I think their operational doctrine, both generally in terms of very small torpedo-armed attack craft, and specifically in terms of the design of some of the PT boats, was a little bit outdated. When you look at the small torpedo-armed craft that have the most success against things that aren't merchant ships, they tend to either be very, very specialist types, like the Mars boats that are not quite but almost suicide boats, or in extremely tight waters like the English Channel, or where you have boats that are operating in coordinated packs and usually have a considerable gun armament as well. And even then, they're usually going after very small craft like Corvette-sized stuff. Trevor Polasek asks, is there an instance of a submarine being destroyed by a surface ship torpedo? I'm not aware of any. There are quite a number of submarines that were sunk by torpedoes fired from other submarines, and there's a disturbingly high number of submarines that were sunk by their own torpedoes. But as far as I can tell, I can't seem to find any references to a submarine being destroyed by a surface vessel launching a torpedo. There are plenty of torpedo boats and destroyers that have attacked submarines, but every reference I can see to those seems to refer to gunfire or depth charges, not to a torpedo, which I suppose would probably make a certain amount of logical sense, because a submarine that's engaged by a torpedo is probably going to see the launch, and even if it doesn't, its hydrophone operators are going to hear the torpedo coming in, and an emergency crash dive, especially in a combat situation, which they're probably already trying to do, if they're caught on the surface in the first place, would almost certainly carry them clear of any such attempt to hit them, even at very close range. So that makes sense, I think, why there don't appear to be submarines destroyed by surface vessel torpedo attacks. The torpedo attacks from other submarines would, of course, not be noticed at first, and therefore they would have far less time to react, if indeed they notice them at all. Anton Alert asks, aside from all the other accolades you could lay at the feet of Admiral Willis Lee, would it be hyperbole to say that he also saved the US Navy by proving once and for all that the use of radar and radar gunnery was vital to success? I think, whilst Admiral Lee is an incredibly accomplished officer, I think that would be a little bit of hyperbole. Not because he didn't demonstrate that radar and radar gunnery was vital to success, but because he wasn't the only one who demonstrated that. Before, you have things like the Battle of Cape Esperance, where radar was quite important, and even the sort of semi-debacle that was the first of the big night actions, the skirmish with Hiei and Kirishima, even that radar had some effect to play, even if it was largely disregarded. And of course, prior to all of these engagements, in fact, the year before, you had things like the Battle of Cape Matapan, which showed that radar and radar gunnery was vital to success over in the Mediterranean. I think if you want to put an accolade to Admiral Lee in this particular circumstance, I think what he demonstrated was that the combination of radar gunnery, officers who understood what they were seeing and what they were doing, and a commanding officer who understood what was going on and how to use it best, put together, actually made for decisive success. Because that had been part of the problem with previous night engagements, and in fact would occasionally be a problem in some of the subsequent night engagements, which was that you might have gunners who could shoot straight, you might have radar operators who could see the targets, and you might have even officers who were reporting back what their men were seeing and aiming their guns in those directions. But quite a bit in 1942, and even in some instances in 1943, what was happening in the US Navy was the senior officers, whether that be a captain, a commodore, or an admiral, were the weak link. They were failing to either comprehend what they were being told, or act on it fast enough, or believe it, but basically they weren't utilizing the information that those other tools were giving them in a way that was actually useful. Whereas Admiral Lee showed that if you actually bothered to pay attention to what you're being told and you'd taken the time and the effort to understand how effective it could be, then you could give the appropriate orders at the appropriate times in order to ensure a devastating victory. And more people should therefore take after that example as opposed to a lot of other examples. And ultimately, it's not a case of saving the US Navy, because the US Navy, let's face it, between its sheer industry and the carriers, could have won World War II just based on that. But what he only did do by demonstrating what he did against Hiroshima, and obviously therefore setting an example for other people to follow, was saving quite a lot of lives in the US Navy. Because if they hadn't followed Lee's example, if they hadn't also obviously learned the lessons of the wider Guadalcanal campaign, then you could have still ended up with scenarios all the way through the war where the US Navy is dominant during the day, but the Japanese Navy is to a certain extent dominant during the night and could come and exact revenge. But as it turned out, as time went on and the US Navy got better and better at utilising its radar, even the cover of night wasn't safe for the Japanese Navy anymore. The Rogue Chief asks, when signing off on the all big gun forward designs for their battleships, did the British and French really think that they might not need a stern gun? Like, say they're on the receiving end of a stern chase and their cruiser and destroyer screens are off somewhere else or have been sunk at the time. Wouldn't it generally be considered worth the cost to protection and speed for the trade-off to have that protection on your 6 in case of that contingency, even with the treaty restrictions? Well, part of the thing was that if they didn't do what they did with the all-forward, then they wouldn't be able to fit the protection, speed and firepower they wanted into 35,000 tons. And if you then rejigged it so you had a fore and aft armament, what are you going to sacrifice? Are you going to make your ship slower? Are you going to make your ship weaker? Are you going to have fewer guns on your ship? Any one of these would obviously then mean that the ship is less capable generally in a standard engagement. Plus, you also have the concept that, at least at the time the Nelsons are designed, there's still quite a few battleships in the Royal Navy, and they're thinking about fighting in a line engagement. So worst comes to worst, if they do have to retreat, they will have other ships that do have rear armament to cover them. Richelieu is being built at a time when maybe that's not quite so much of an issue, but then at the same time, Richelieu is being built with a speed such that, at least at the time she's under construction, almost anything that she might end up facing that she might need to run away from, she has a speed advantage over, at least as far as they know at the time. And you also have to contend with the fact that a dead stern chase, where the enemy is 180 degrees behind you and you can't fire your forward armament back at them, is an exceptionally unlikely one. If you've been engaged in something approximating a broadside-on-broadside engagement and you need to break away from your opponent, the chances of your opponent being directly perpendicular to your new course as you head away from them at the time you break away are very, very slim, which means that when they come after you, they are going to be coming after you off to one side, basically in an echelon or chevron style. And that means that if you have enough of a rear arc of fire with at least some of your guns, so on the Nelson class, for example, A and B turrets, on the Richelieus, either one of the quads, then you can still get a bearing on them, even if they are mostly behind you. And now they could, in theory, maneuver directly behind you to shield themselves from the effects of your gunfire, but you can turn slightly to counter that. Plus, if they are in a sort of chevron or echelon formation to you, that means they, in theory, can bring to bear all of their guns, including their aft turrets, whereas if they are dead astern of you, unless they want to lose ground, especially chasing something like Richelieu, they would have to be proceeding almost fully bow on, which means that they can only unleash their forward armament, which is going to have a significantly lesser chance of hitting, and obviously it's only a half salvo in the case of a ship with 4 twin turrets, or a 2/3 salvo in the case of a ship with 3 triples, where they've got 2 triples forward, 1 triple aft. So that reduces their firepower, and if they do start landing things a bit too close, you can do evasive action, and evasive action will probably bring your guns into arcs of fire anyway. So actually, having no main batteries, guns astern, doesn't actually represent too much of a weakness even in a stern chase. It is theoretically a possibility, but it's a relatively small possibility when set against the fact that by having the all-forward arrangement, you can make your ship more heavily armoured and or more heavily armed and or faster than a more conventionally laid out ship of that period. And that in turn means that you're more likely to be the one who's chasing your opponent in the first place, rather than the other way around, because if they've gone with all-round firepower, they will have made compromises, which in theory, assuming they've kept to the treaty limits, might well have made their ship the weaker one. And that brings us to the end of this dry dock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Now, assuming that you are listening to this on the day of release, I will be just about wrapping up the Australia trip. I believe I will have a few days left, at which point I will be returning, and I will hopefully be seeing some more of you at Tankfest at the end of next week, which is when the Patreon Dry Dock Part 1 will be releasing. At that point, hopefully see some of you at Tankfest, and for the rest of you, see you again in another video.